Today on CityCast Pittsburgh. Sloppy, unprofessional, not remotely near reality. These are direct quotes from critics describing Mayor Ed Gainey's proposed budget for 2026. But that is not how Gainey's team sees it. Today I'm sitting down with Deputy Mayor Jake Pawlak to hear his defense of this budget, what he sees as its biggest bright spots, what we're going to do about losing the jock tax, and his overall take on whether we can afford to actually host the 2026 NFL Draft. It's Tuesday, October 21st. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. Jake Pawlak, welcome to CityCast Pittsburgh.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
So the city has released its first draft of the budget. It was a couple of weeks ago now. The reviews have been a little scathing. I know you've probably read them. I mean, can I read you a few lines here?
Yeah, sure.
Inadequate, unrealistic, nothing about it adds up, crafted to spite the next mayor, glaring omissions, does not tell the truth about the city's basic operating expenses. What goes through your head when you hear that kind of stuff?
You know, it comes with the territory, first of all, right? I mean, this is not the first time that there's been criticism of this administration, certainly, and a lot of that has centered on finances. You know, it's not accurate, right? It's some of those, in fact, maybe some of the thing that's most difficult to hear is the notion that any of this is coming out of the blue, right? I think that we've been very clear going all the way back to 2022 about the shape of things to come, right? And what we saw in not just the next year from that year, but the full 5-year span. Something that's important for people to know, and I think not enough Pittsburghers understand this, is when the city was in financial oversight, which you'll often hear referred to as Act 47.
We've talked a lot about that on this show, but if you're new, it's like a thing where we have to ask permission to spend money. Correct.
And we're not in that anymore.
Yep. It was a long time, though, 2003 to 2018.
Exactly. One of the things that program requires is that you don't just make a budget for the next year. Right. The average municipality or school district or county in Pennsylvania only has to budget for the upcoming year. Entities in Act 47 actually have to show a 5-year plan. They need to show not just what their spending decisions about the next year are going to mean for that year, but also how that carries on for 5 years.
Right.
And I can't remember if they did it in 2017 or 2018, but in preparation for leaving Act 47 in 2018, the city and during the Peduto administration, I give that administration and council great credit for this. They incorporated that 5-year process into the city's code, meaning that even as we left Act 47, we continue to do that 5-year process.
Yeah.
It means that the decisions we make have that long-term lens on them, and that balance that we strike between improving public services, because that's the other side of the Act 47 story that certainly got talked a lot about while it was happening, but we think about less now. The amount of city spending and service delivery that was cut in that time it decimated the city's ability to do things. And we've been struggling ever since 2003 to really meet our basic obligations to our residents. When people wonder, why it takes us longer than neighboring municipalities to plow the snow, or why it can sometimes take a while to get a permit or anything that they need from us, that is still a factor. We're still dealing with that legacy. And we can't operate like that forever, right? So there is a balance to be struck between rebuilding our core ability to do the work of a city and fiscal prudence.
I think one of the hardest examples I've seen recently, because this was way before my time here in the city and I hadn't thought about it in these terms, if you've ever looked over at the empty pool in Lawrenceville and wondered why don't we have that, it's because we lost half our pools back in the early 2000s because of Act 47. We could not afford to keep them open. They weren't drawing guests the way they needed to be. And so Lawrenceville wasn't the place it is now. It was not that kind of happening neighborhood with booming population growth. They decided to close the pool. These are the hard effects of going through a process like that.
Absolutely. And also, once you close something like a pool,
you can't get it back.
Right.
Because nature takes it way too fast.
Exactly. So yes, that's exactly right. And so that's a combined effect of Act 47 itself it didn't happen in isolation, right? Act 47 was the culmination of a decades-long process before that of population loss owing to the collapse of the steel industry. So some amount of that contraction had to happen. But we need to be thinking about how we reinvest in services, even as we need to be wary of financial headwinds. And that does bring us to a newer dynamic. So the first thing that we identified was the coming, tight budget years as a result of debt retirement. Something that has emerged, and you can even see it as an emerging story in the budgets we've produced, is this is a technical sounding thing, the common level ratio. Right? Basically, a group of taxpayers sued Allegheny County as the pandemic was coming to an end, saying that the formula that the county uses to calculate the sort of baseline number in property tax appeals was flawed. It was too high. And a judge agreed with them and dramatically reduced it, but also critically put in place kind of a progression where it goes down a little bit every year.
Which is a good thing if you're the one paying the bills, but is a less good thing if you enjoy having your trash picked up.
Precisely. So it's not a sustainable situation for anyone, and it can only be solved by reassessment. Right? A reassessment would reset that formula back to 100.
Which, once again, I believe at this point, it seems like our local leaders are saying, state of Pennsylvania, will you just call for this so that we don't have to?
I think there are a number of ways that could be solved. That's one. Pennsylvania is an outlier.
It's so unpopular to call for a property reassessment. I get it. The last person to do it was the county executive, Dan Honorato. He did not get reelected. So
actually, it was a court that told him he had to do it.
Fair, but he was the guy in charge. He was left holding the bag.
That's true. And so I bring that up because also, again, there is a court case right now where the Pittsburgh School District is suing the county saying they need to reassess. That's a common way that this gets forced to happen through litigation. The other way to do it would be legislation, right? In Harrisburg, having a consistent schedule for these. None of those are within the city's control. But what I can say is we see that number going down every year. I'll go back to my earlier point, though. Because we look 5 years out, we can see how much we think it will go down. And so at the beginning of the process of preparing this budget, we went in clear-eyed about the possibility of having to propose a tax increase or make significant spending cuts. But the thing that's critical to understand is if we had to do either of those things, and we did end up proposing significant but not destructive spending cuts, what we really would be solving for is not what we can afford next year, but what we can afford in 2030. And the ability to see that far out is critical to, I think, the way we should be talking about this budget, but we're not really. So we cut 50 vacant positions. These are positions that are in the budget that haven't been filled. Some of them are clerical positions that haven't been filled for a really long time because institutions and organizations don't use as much administrative staff as they did before. That's 8 positions right there. Based on where we are in police recruiting, where we are about to bring on what we believe to be the biggest police recruiting class since we reopened the police academy in 2023, we still don't see a path to, we think we can get to 800 police officers next year, which would be a significant accomplishment, but not to the 825 that was previously projected. So we pulled that number back a little bit. Between eliminating some positions and then cutting almost $3.5 million in non-personnel spending next year, we can project a budget that is balanced, that meets our requirements for how much money we have in the rainy day fund, and that manages how much we're spending on debt all the way through 2030. And so that's what we proposed.
So that's what, I mean, I don't know that you call it good news, but like when you talk about things that you're proud of, I guess, in terms of managing this budget, is that it? Like no tax increase, no layoffs, cutting positions as best you can.
Yeah.
Is there anything else on that list?
No cuts to core services, right? I mean, we've trimmed.
So the snowplows will keep going.
Absolutely. In fact, we'll buy more of them, right? And another thing I'm proud of in this budget is it's the highest level of spending we've seen in a while. and this has been true over the course of our 4 years, in spending on our fleet. Is it the amount we need to be spending to fully catch up to the challenges we face? No. We have about $200 million in needed investment in our fleet in order to get it in a state of good repair, based on a report that the fleet manager that we hired, who has experience with this kind of turnaround.
Can you imagine getting that many cars inspected at the same time? Like, it's a painful process for a driver when you just have the one vehicle, let alone hundreds of them, and they're big and they're complicated and they're dirty.
Yeah. Luckily we do the inspections at our own garage.
Of course,
that makes it simple. But no, it is a gargantuan task, as is.
But that's the thing. You have to replace parts, you have to service them, and occasionally you have to actually whole cloth replace it.
Mm-hmm. And we have better methodology than we've had at any point in the past for determining when to do that, down to, when you've spent 30% more on repairs than the original purchase price of the car, it's just time to take it out of service, right? We never had systems or predictable metrics for that kind of thing in the past.
Every time I hear a city leader say we never had a system, knowing that we're 250 years old, depending on how you count, it makes me laugh a little.
But it's true. It is funny. It is a shame, right? But these things evolve.
Of course.
Organizations and institutions like a city government evolve over time. And the oldest institutions are the ones that have the hardest time changing, right? It's so.
This is Astoria, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it is. I'm proud of the progress we made, but that's another thing I'm proud of, right? That we are making those investments. We are continuing to make investments in our bridges, in inspecting them and repairing them, but most importantly, maintaining them so that they don't end up in such bad shape again in the future.
One thing with the fleet, though, I think if I read it right, the 2026 budget suggests $25 million over 5 years, when what we need is $20 million per year, so $100 million over 5 years.
That's right. And I think that is one of the critical questions facing the city over the long term, right, is how we address that question. We have tried to increase incrementally the level of funding we're allocating there and use data to tell us where the most critical needs are. Mm-hmm. And so, we're both making, I think, a meaningful investment, though not the entire one that's necessary.
It's so frustrating as a Pittsburgher to hear that, like, we can only afford to do a quarter of what we need to, I get it. I understand. But like, I'm sure, you live here too. Mm-hmm. Like, that's got to be like, I don't know, like a little annoying to look at the paper and be like, boy, it sure would be nice.
I think in some ways that's my whole job, right? is having that feeling. But I also just have to think about it in terms of the trade-offs, right? What would it mean to fully fund that fleet need for our parks or for our rec centers, right? And so it is truly a balancing act.
I think we all know the feeling of like wishing we had a few more dollars in our pocket.
Exactly.
CityCast Pittsburgh is sponsored by the Frick Pittsburgh Museum and Gardens. They just opened their latest exhibit, The Scandinavian Home, Landscape and Lore. I'm going to be honest, when I first heard that name, my mind jumped straight to IKEA furniture, but there will be no cardboard mountains or Allen wrenches if you visit the Frick. And the exhibit actually includes a lot more than furniture. You're going to get to peek at decor and folk art. Think ceramics, glass, paintings, textiles, sculptures even from Denmark and Norway, Sweden, and Finland. The Scandinavian Home has over 100 never-seen-before items from a private collector. So you'll be transported to a world where the domestic and the mythic meet. There are princesses, trolls, gnomes, a lot of fairy tale magic. It's all just so cozy and perfect for this time of year. The Scandinavian Home, Landscape and Lore is on view through January 11th, 2026. Perfect for your holiday plans. Get your tickets at thefrickpittsburgh.org. Today's episode is sponsored in part by Family House. For families traveling here for medical care, the cost of food is just another expense to worry about. But Family House's daily healthy breakfast program takes away some of that stress, while also providing a little connection. The program's available to all Family House guests, and it provides nourishing meals, a welcoming space, and the chance to meet others facing similar medical challenges. But the cost of this meal program is going up. Family House needs your help Every donation helps keep breakfast and the support it provides available to those who need it most. You can give at familyhouse.org/donate and save the date for Family House's Day of Giving. It's December 2nd on Giving Tuesday. You know, Family House really is a home away from home for patients and caregivers here in Pittsburgh, and it's the preferred lodging partner for a lot of our healthcare systems here. So again, if you want to support their cause, head over to familyhouse.org/donate. Let's talk a little bit more about some of those challenges. And really, I mean, again, like speaking directly to what some of the critics of this budget have pointed to, a big one, of course, is overtime. I think the city controller's report in April suggested that we were going to be like 15 million over on overtime. She suggested those figures a little bit, I think, since then. But how does that hit you? Because I think that's one of the big things, like public safety specifically, but a lot of departments overall, that we're just not budgeting enough for what we absolutely know we're going to spend.
There's a fair degree of misunderstanding there. And this isn't something I would expect the public to understand. Candidly, it is something that I would expect the controller to understand slightly better. But so it may be true that we spend $15 million more on overtime or a figure in that ballpark than was originally budgeted. The net impact on the budget we project now to be $2 million. Now, how does that happen, right? When you look at the entirety of salaries, including overtime, spending more on overtime than projected, increases the amount we're spending. Positions that are vacant for 2 months between when someone leaves and when a replacement is hired pulls in the other direction. That's money that's budgeted that isn't spent, right? And departments that aren't using their overtime, even though it's typically smaller, our biggest sources of overtime are the ones where we have the most staff, public safety and public works. But we look at salaries and benefits as one category of spending, right? And that category will only be about $2 million over, which in the context of a almost $700 million budget is 0.3%, right? When you think about the totality of managing a budget of this size, there are variances that kind of come out in the wash. So I don't mean to suggest we did underestimate overtime last year, and there are some very specific reasons that happened. One is when we designed the budget, it was before we had to close the Panther Hollow Bridge. We've had to have basically an entire extra fire crew on overtime 24/7 since that happened to station an additional truck on the other side of the bridge from where the firehouse is to handle response time. So
I've got a budget pulled up. I think if I'm reading this right, the fire department spent $22 million in overtime in 2024. This year we're budgeted for $16 million, and 2026 we're budgeting for $17.5 million, but still not even close to what we spent in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, part of the process also is trying to reduce the amount of overtime we're
So you're trying to do both and at the same time.
Correct. We're increasing it slightly in our 2026 projection because we recognize we were maybe overly ambitious in our 2025 projection, but we still want to use less, and we still want to use management tools to utilize less. And we've been working with the chief and the union and others on ways we can do that. Another great example is in EMS, right? We have been spending a lot of overtime in EMS for many, many years. We had a pretty awful situation there, frankly, where we didn't have enough paramedics. There's a national shortage, frankly, of paramedics. And
if you're interested in the field, please consider it. CCAC has an interesting program right now. Check it out.
You could also become a paramedic by starting out as an EMT and getting that training directly from the city of Pittsburgh through our Freedom House Academy, which is exactly where I'm going. National shortage of paramedics, didn't have enough to fill all the shifts. So we were routinely having paramedics do forced overtime, which even though the pay is pretty good, no one likes to be forced to work extra shifts, right? It was a major point of contention with the medics themselves, and it was costing us a lot of money. We made adjustments in our most recent collective bargaining agreement with the paramedics that would allow us for the first time to send out what's called a combo unit. So traditionally, it's either 2 paramedics in an ambulance, and that's called an advanced life support unit. They can do some things that an EMT can't do.
The people with the most training.
Exactly. or 2 EMTs in a basic life support unit, and they can do more routine things. For the first time, we had one paramedic or the ability to do one paramedic and one EMT.
I imagine that's like going to be so much more freeing and flexible in terms of scheduling.
Totally is. But there have been, without getting into the nitty gritty details, right, moving from negotiating that into the contract and working out all the kinks of implementation, right, has taken some time and some learning. And so we expected more savings on the overtime from that in the first year than we've been seeing. But we still do expect it to have a major impact in the long run. And importantly, we started training our own EMTs. We've now had the ability to put them into combo units where they're getting to work next to a paramedic. We have 13 EMTs who, because they've been for the most part, because they've been in a combo unit and worked next to a paramedic, are presently in paramedic school. And we believe that we're going to fill a much greater share of the unfilled paramedic shifts that we've had for a long time, or slots, not by recruiting someone who already has the training, of which there's a national shortage, but by training our own.
Building from within. I'm so happy for y'all. If any of those 13 are listening, I'm so stoked for you.
And the great thing about that is it will mean probably for the first time, we'll have, in decades, we'll have every available paramedic slot full, which will again reduce the amount of overtime we need to utilize. So these are incremental long-term challenges.
I hear you. And I can see like how, you're trying to do that like real time live balancing of, shuffling the money as best you can. And in a normal year, I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, whatever a normal year is anymore, right? But next year, 2026, we're doing the NFL draft, which Mayor Gainey has been so proud of, and I understand why it gets us so much attention. But the overtime bill for that is going to be massive. I think I read 2,500 officers, just police officers, were used for the one in Detroit, which is anticipated to be somewhat on par with what Pittsburgh's is going to be in terms of people attending, the 3 days of events, and just the stuff that we have signed on to do. Like, we are contractually obligated to provide, from making sure all the light bulbs to turn on and the trash cans are empty, to like having things like canines everywhere and doing security sweeps and bomb sniffing and uniformed officers stationed, intelligence. Like, we even have like an aviation piece of this, which I find fascinating. I mean, when you look at that and you look at this budget, does it still make sense for you?
It does, because we don't provide, and we're not obligated in that agreement to provide all of those services alone, right? The public.
Well, we have to front the bill for it.
The public safety services for the draft are going to be provided by a combination of the folks who are participating. The state police will be involved in that. They are also part of our bid, Allegheny County and their police and the sheriff's department, but also police from surrounding municipalities.
Granted, but like, I mean, I'm reading the contract here and it says the host city will cover all costs related to deploying police, fire, emergency, medical, street closures, police escorts, like tactical support units. That's a lot. If indeed that means we're left with a bill.
It means that the host committee, the local host, these will not be exclusively City of Pittsburgh costs. I do grant that there are one-time costs that the City of Pittsburgh will incur as a result of this event that are unusual, and we have to be prepared for that.
And you were just talking about the medics, for example. Like, they've already received word that they cannot take vacation. So, like, we know they're all going to get overtime that weekend.
Absolutely. I don't deny any of that at all. But it ultimately, to answer your question, yes, I do feel that we are financially and operationally prepared to handle the task of managing the draft in coordination with surrounding police forces and public safety services and our hospitals. I think that we are in position to do that. And I think we are financially in a position to do that as well.
It makes me nervous.
Well,
I mean, reading about Detroit, for example, I'll tell you exactly why. Like, they were talking about those 2,500 officers. The city of Detroit doesn't have anywhere close to that many police. They brought in state police and folks from different municipalities, but in doing so, they also had to put them up in hotels. They had to pay for their meals, their gas in some cases. Like, it's just a lot of sundry costs that comes along, and that's just the public safety component. Like, we have an $11 million budget, but as I understand it, that's separate from fronting the costs for all of these like basic things of the city.
Some of it is, there are costs in that $11 million that are unique to the local host committee, that are things that the city doesn't participate in, like marketing and some of the events and things like that.
And Visit Pittsburgh's handling that. They're in control of that $11 million.
Some portion of that money, though, is to at least contribute to some of these service costs, right? And there's an agreement between the city and Visit Pittsburgh that articulates what the money that we've contributed can pay for, and covering some of these costs as part of that budget. The county has a similar agreement. We are waiting for a state budget that will say what the state's contribution to the draft preparations will be.
I didn't even think about waiting for that for the state budget.
Right.
The other thing that's way late.
Yes. So there are many moving pieces to this. And to your point about being nervous, no one in my position or a position of leadership in local government could possibly not be nervous about this, because it is a gargantuan undertaking. But, I sit on the executive committee for the draft host committee, and have been close to this project from the beginning. I have a great deal of confidence, as you said, in the folks at Visit Pittsburgh, who are, to use a football analogy, quarterbacking the whole process, as well as all the other stakeholders around the table who will have a role to play in this. And I think that we will show the world quite a favorable image of Pittsburgh in this draft, including being prepared for all of these contingencies.
I have no doubt we're going to put on an amazing party. I just worry about the cleanup after the fact and whatever bill may come due.
The picketers who stand outside Planned Parenthood health centers are bullies, plain and simple. They try to shame healthcare providers and volunteers and shame patients. They also spread lies and misinformation. More than 3,300 picketers stand outside Planned Parenthood of Western Pennsylvania health centers each year. Well, October is National Bullying Prevention Month, so let's do something about it. This fall, PPWP is relaunching the Pledge a Picketer program, the easiest way to fight back directly against every one of these protesters outside. You select a monthly gift level, which is based on the number of picketers outside PPWP health centers. And for 1 year, you've ensured that every anti-abortion extremist outside also helps keep Planned Parenthood open. It's the perfect way to stand up to bullies compromising access to healthcare. Join the PPWP Pledge a Picketer program and be part of this powerful direct response to extremist attacks on healthcare. Visit bit.ly/ppwpcitycast. That's bit.ly/ppwpcitycast.
Another thing that has popped off recently in your life, City Councilwoman Teresa Cale Smith has said recently that she wants to formally freeze city spending. If I'm reading that right, that would mean like cutting most hiring. It would cut off a lot of city credit cards. Outside grants would get paused. And then like non-essentials like purchasing and travel and some overtime. You said to some local media that you are very glad she did not make that official. Why do you think that's a bad move right now?
Well, there are categories of spending that we ourselves we always monitor very closely, but particularly heading into the end of this year, knowing that next year will be challenging, right? We are being especially frugal about. And so I think the impulse to be especially mindful about those things is not wrong. The sort of cleaver where a scalpel is needed approach that was laid out in the legislation that the councilwoman initially put onto the agenda and then withdrew would have gone far beyond managing spending towards the end of the year into disrupting pretty dramatically the way that the city does business. Freezing all of those purchasing cards is a great example, right? We use those in many cases because of modern payment systems. We can only use those to do things like paying for court filings, right? Freezing those cards for the law department, which was not excluded in her legislation, would have completely brought all of our litigation or just normal legal work, the filing of deeds, that kind of thing, to a complete standstill, right? So it would have been a major disruption to city services. Similarly, we have contracts and vendors who are expecting payment. There's actually a real legal conundrum that this would create when you have, on the one hand, a resolution that prohibits certain forms of spending, on the other hand, a valid contract that we have invoices against that need to be paid, right? We would actually be putting ourselves into a legal bind by that. So I was glad that legislation didn't move forward because I thought it was overly broad. And really, I think that the place to have those conversations is in the annual consideration of the budget.
How would you compare what Cale Smith suggested, did not pursue, but suggested in terms of a freeze to what Allegheny County and Pittsburgh Public Schools are doing? Because they've both implemented hiring and spending freezes sort of in response to what's happening with the state budget.
They're far more reliant on state and federal funding than local government is. So yes, if I had my same role at Allegheny County or at Pittsburgh Public Schools, I would very likely be implementing similar policies to what they're implementing, because the federal government shutdown and the state budget impasse have a much more direct line of impact to their budgets, right? They get, in some cases, more than 50%. Like some county departments are almost completely funded by the state, not by local tax dollars. So those changes are unfortunately necessary for agencies that are that reliant on state or federal funds. As I said, we are being discerning about which positions need to be filled, similar with other expense requests. If you need operating supplies like PPE, between now and the end of the year, we are buying that. If you want to load up on a year and a half's worth of staples, we're probably not going to approve that expenditure right now. So I think everyone is monitoring these things, but the extent to which it has to be an across-the-board policy is dictated by a number of things.
Got it. Okay, masks good, staples maybe not. I mean, as we close out, I guess, our conversation about the budget, I do wonder one thing, because I've seen it sort of hinted at in stories and the way people are talking about this budget. And I'm curious how you would respond to it. When Sarah Innamorato, our county executive, took over for the county last year, she has said that she knew right away that one of her first orders of business would be to propose a tax increase, because the outgoing administration, Rich Fitzgerald at the time, had said repeatedly for years, you're going to have to do this eventually, but he never did it. And they knew they didn't have enough cash, and they didn't want to do the unpopular thing to propose it. I'm curious if you think this administration is doing that to the next city mayor.
No, I don't. And I don't think that because, as I said at the outset of this part of the conversation, we're not only showing right now that we don't need it to make the budget work next year, we're showing that the budget will work through 2030 without a tax increase. What I can't say, because I can't see that far into the future, is when they come to budget season next year, what 2031 will look like, because it's not yet in the forecast. And so they may confront challenges there, they may not. We came into this budget prepared for the possibility of having to propose a tax increase if the financial projections for as far out as 2030 warranted it, and we found that it didn't. We've taken the view that fiscal responsibility is a crucial element of governing a city, but it is also a means to an end and not an end in and of itself, right? The end is being able to provide city residents with the services that they absolutely need, and being able to do it in a way that will allow you to continue to do that for the long term. You mentioned the previous county administration, and I'm not saying this as a criticism, but I think by their own admission, right, there were choices made not to increase taxes or consider a tax increase, to the detriment of also expanding services in service of what the bottom line ultimately looked like. That is a model of governance that people apply, and it's a legitimate one.
Former county executive Rich Fitzgerald, if you read even just the first page of his budget documents for like the last 3 years, they straight up say, we're going to need a tax increase at some point. It's not today.
Yeah. And in some sense, we're saying the same thing, I think, in that it is, at least in the "it is not today" part, right? There are a couple of solutions that could avoid it. But big picture, right? We have reinvested in the Department of Public Works to be able to provide a higher level of service to our residents, and we're seeing the tangible results of that. The Office of Community Health and Safety went from, I believe, 8 people when Mayor Gainey took office to nearly 80 today. And they're doing all kinds of things, not just co-response, but also street outreach to our unhoused neighbors, and programs that proactively visit the most frequent repeat customers of emergency services to try and get upstream of their needs, so that we're not only dealing with them, when they need emergency medical attention, but, if they have other behavioral health or social determinants of health challenges, sort of getting upstream of that. post-overdose response in the past. A first responder treats someone with Narcan, brings them back from an overdose, and then they're on to the next call. That person is in a pretty vulnerable state. We now have folks that go and sit with them and help them connect to services in that moment of acute need. So we've rebuilt some portion of the city's ability to do the things that I think our residents expect it to do for them, while also managing for the fiscal realities that we face. And it is that balance that I think has been the hallmark of our budgetary management for the city.
And for critics who point to some of these numbers and say, like, yeah, the budget is maybe balanced, but it's just not accurate to what we will likely spend, that money has to come from somewhere. What do you say?
I would point to the last 3 years worth of operating results, right?
But we had ARPA money then. We had COVID money.
But that is perhaps, I think, one of the most misleading parts of this conversation, because we had that money and we had a 5-year plan that showed it going away. That was all accounted for. So the fact that we had it in the past and don't have it now doesn't change the bottom line calculation. We'll still have a surplus at the end of this year, a small one compared to the past, but we will have one. And that's what I would point to, that yes, you can look at any individual category of spending and say the estimates were off here. The picture is tight, but it is not, I think, not unrealistic at all. In fact, I think it presents a very real sense of the city's small margin for error, perhaps, but not an overly optimistic picture of where we'll land.
Are you planning to amend the 2026 budget to acknowledge that we will not be able to collect the jock tax anymore, our facility usage fee? So that's where entertainers and performers who come here have typically had to pay a little tax on top of it.
It's already in the 2026 proposal that's gone away.
But what about like acknowledging, because those folks will have to apply to get a refund. It's not automatic, but if I'm reading the court documents right, they have going back as far as 2016 to do that. And that's 9 years worth of potential refunds.
The 3 plaintiffs in the case have that. So the 3 performers who were part of the lawsuit.
Okay, that's your read on it, not anyone who performed here?
No, that would require further litigation to answer that question.
Okay, so the city's planning for maybe those 3 going back 9 years.
That's right. Even that will be the subject of further hearings because we have a 3-year statute of limitations. And so the question about refunds is very much still unresolved.
Well, we will leave it there. Jake Pawlak, thank you so much. You will hear from him again tomorrow, but for now, we will say goodbye. Jake, thank you so much for joining us here on CityCast.
Yeah, thank you.
That is all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. Reminder to tune in tomorrow for part 2. Pawlak is back to talk about the latest twist in the debate over the mayor's inclusionary zoning plan, that new amendment you've heard us talk about, and why Pawlak says he was blindsided by the whole thing earlier this month. You can support us by becoming a CityCast Pittsburgh neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We're going to be back tomorrow with more from around the city. We'll talk to you soon.
Spoiler alert, we're not going to be hiring any new people into the mayor's office between now and the end of the year.
In fact, you are already starting to lose people, which is just a normal process of a mayoral administration change.
Absolutely.